She was 38 years old, and by the summer of 1887 she owned nothing in this world but a carpet bag, a black wool dress gone gray at the seams, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. Her name was Odessa Vane, and the man who put her out onto the road was her late husband's brother, Colwyn Vane, who had decided, 3 months after the burying, that a widow with no children and no deed to her name was a debt he no longer cared to carry. He told her so on the porch of the house she had scrubbed for 11 years, in front of the hired man, and did not so much as offer her a wagon ride to town. So Odessa walked the 7 miles into Merrow's Bend with her bag against her hip, and when she reached the far end of Cinder Street, past the shuttered mercantile and the church with a leaning steeple, she found a blacksmith's forge that had sat cold and empty for 9 years, ever since old Elias Pruitt died with no kin to claim it. The county had it posted for auction that very afternoon, and not one soul in Merrow's Bend wanted a rotting shed with a rusted anvil and a chimney full of birds' nests. Odessa Vane paid $4 for it, and the men on the courthouse steps laughed behind their hands as she signed her name. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that behind the crumbling brick of that forge-back wool-layered truth that had been waiting 9 years to be found, a truth that would not only remake her own life but call this whole broken town back from the edge of forgetting itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Vane. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, we hope you will tell us so in the comments, because this story is for you. Odessa had not always been a woman who counted pennies in a handkerchief. She was born in 1849 in a hollow outside Staunton, Virginia, the third daughter of a wheelwright named Josiah Kearns, a patient, broad-shouldered man who believed that anything broken could be mended if a person was willing to sit with it long enough to understand why it had broken in the first place. Her mother, Ruth, died of a fever when Odessa was 9, and after that it was Josiah who raised her, mostly in the wheelwright shop, because there was nowhere else for a motherless girl to be while her father worked. She grew up among the smell of hot iron and cut ash wood, learning to read the grain of timber with her fingers before she learned her letters properly, learning the particular silence a man falls into when he is fitting a metal band to a wheel and cannot be spoken to until it is done. Josiah was not a blacksmith by trade, but he kept a small forge behind the shop for shoeing the draft horses and mending iron fittings, and it was there, at 11 years old, that Odessa first learned to work a bellows, to read the color of heated iron the way other girls read hymnals, orange for soft, yellow for shaping, white for danger. Her father used to say that iron never lied to you if you paid attention. It told you exactly what it needed, in its color and its give, and the only failures in the shop came from men too proud or too hurried to listen. That lesson planted itself somewhere deep in Odessa and never left her, not through childhood, not through war, not through all the losses that came after. The war took her eldest brother, Amos, at Chancellorsville, and it took something from her father too, though he lived another 6 years after it ended. Josiah Kearns grew quieter, slower to laugh, and in 1868 he sat Odessa down in the shop, now failing for lack of customers in a county gutted by the war, and told her plainly that he had nothing to leave her but his tools and his knowledge, and that a woman who knew how to work iron and wood with her own 2 hands would never again be entirely at the mercy of any man's charity. He died that winter. Odessa, 19 and alone, sold what remained of the shop stock, kept her father's smaller hand tools wrapped in oilcloth, and went to live with a distant cousin in Lynchburg, where she worked as a seamstress for 6 years, patient and precise, because sewing and smithing asked the same question of her hands, whether she could make something true out of raw material. It was there she met Thomas Vane, a gentle, unambitious man who had come east looking for work and found her instead, and in 1870 for they married and moved west together, first to Missouri, then finally to a modest farm outside Merrow's Bend in the Kansas Territory borderlands, where Thomas's older brother Colwyn had already staked a claim and prospered modestly in cattle. Thomas was a good husband, if not a strong one. He suffered from a weak chest as the prairie winters worsened year upon year, and Odessa nursed him through a dozen bad seasons, kept their small house, kept a garden that fed half the poorer families on their road in lean years, and never once complained, because complaining was not a language her father had taught her. She had no children, a sorrow she carried privately and never let harden into bitterness. What she had instead was a steadiness that people in Merrow's Bend had come, quietly, to rely upon, though few of them would have said so aloud, because Odessa Vane was not the kind of woman who asked to be noticed. Thomas Vane died in the spring of 1887, coughing his last in the same bed where he had coughed for 13 years, and Odessa buried him beside a cottonwood tree on the property line, believing, in her grief, that whatever else was uncertain in her life, at least the roof over her head was settled. She was wrong. The farm had never been put in her name. Thomas had always meant to see to it and never had, the way gentle, unambitious men often mean to see to things. And when he died intestate, Kansas law and Corwin Vane's sharp memory of it agreed that the land reverted to the nearest Vane blood relation, which was Corwin, not Odessa. Corwin had never liked his brother's wife, not because she had wronged him, but because she had never needed him, and a woman who needed nothing from a man like Corwin Vane was, to him, a kind of insult. He waited a decent 3 months, long enough to avoid open scandal, and then he came to the house with a paper from the county clerk and a wagon he did not offer to lend her, and he told Odessa that she had a week to gather what was rightfully his and go. What was rightfully his, it turned out, fit into one carpet bag, her father's old oilcloth roll of hand tools, 2 dresses, a Bible, a daguerreotype of Thomas as a young man, and the $11 she had managed to save from selling eggs and preserves over the years, money Corwin did not know existed because she had never trusted him enough to keep it in the house's strong box. She left the garden she had tended for 13 years without looking back, because looking back, her father used to say, only slowed the wagon. She walked into Merrow's Bend on a hot, dust-heavy morning in June, and the town she found was not much better off than she was. Merrow's Bend had been built on the promise of a rail spur that never came, and half its storefronts stood empty, their windows painted over or simply broken, their owners gone west chasing better luck. The only real business left were Halloran's Mercantile, a diminished bank run by a cautious man named Ezra Combs, 2 saloons, a church with more roof than congregation, and a scattering of homes belonging to people too stubborn, too poor, or too rooted to leave. It was Ezra Combs, in fact, standing on the courthouse step that morning overseeing a county property auction of tax-forfeited lots, who first told Odessa about the old Pruitt forge, though he told her mostly to be kind, not because he thought she would buy it. Elias Pruitt had been the town's blacksmith for 30 years, a solitary old Welshman with no family that anyone in Merrow's Bend had ever met, and when he died in 1878, alone in the back room of his own shop, the county had simply padlocked the door and let the taxes accumulate against it for 9 years, as it had with a dozen other abandoned lots in a town too poor to care. The forge stood at the dead end of Cinder Street, its shingled roof sagging on one corner, its chimney choked with swallows' nests, its front window boarded with warped planks gone silver with weather. Nobody had set foot inside it in almost a decade, and nobody, Ezra Combs said with a not unkind laugh, was likely to bid on today either, because the town had already decided the old Pruitt place was cursed, or at the very least worthless, its equipment surely rusted beyond use and its foundation, some said, unsound. Odessa Vane stood at the back of the small crowd gathered for the auction, counting her $11 in her mind. And when the auctioneer called the Pruitt lot and asked for an opening bid, a silence fell that was almost embarrassing in its completeness. Men shuffled and looked at their boots. Somebody near the front snorted and said the county ought to pay someone to haul the wreck away rather than sell it. It was in that silence, with the summer sun beating down on the courthouse steps and every eye avoiding the auctioneers, that Odessa heard her own voice say $4, and felt the crowd turn to look at her the way people look at something they cannot quite believe. The auctioneer, more surprised than anyone, asked if she was certain, and Odessa, who had learned patience from a wheelwright and grief from a war and dignity from 13 years of being the last steady thing in a dying man's house, said that she was. Nobody raised against her. The gavel came down, and just like that, for $4 in the cost of her own pride, Odessa Vane on a dead man's forge that the whole town had already buried in its mind. She walked down Cinder Street that same afternoon with the key the county clerk had produced from an old cigar box, a key that took some working before the padlock, rusted solid, finally gave way with a groan that seemed to come from the building itself rather than the mechanism. The door stuck at the bottom and she had to lean her shoulder into it, and when it finally scraped open, 9 years of trapped, stale air rolled out to meet her, thick with dust and the ghost smell of old coal smoke, mildewed leather, and something faintly sweet underneath it all that she could not name. Inside, the forge was exactly as Elias Pruitt had left it the day he died, the great stone half cold and gray, the leather bellows collapsing cracked, an anvil furred with rust standing where he had last set it down, tongs and hammers hanging from pegs in a neat, deliberate row that spoke of a careful man, not a careless one. And along the back wall, shelves of small tools and jars gone opaque with dust. Sunlight slanted in through gaps in the boarded window, illuminating a slow, endless drift of dust motes, and Odessa stood in the doorway for a long moment simply breathing it in, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something other than grief and humiliation settle over her, a strange, quiet recognition, as though she had walked not into a stranger's room but into a room built for her hand specifically. Her first days at the forge were spent simply making it livable. She swept 9 years of dust and swallow droppings from the floor, pried the boards from the window, and let real light in for the first time since Chester Arthur were president, and discovered, with a particular joy of a woman who had spent her whole life mending things others discarded, that the equipment was not nearly so ruined as the town believed. The bellows needed new leather, but the frame was sound. The anvil, once she had worked the rust from it with sand and vinegar, rang true and clear when she struck it, a sound that carried strangely far down the empty street and drew, on her third day there, the curious face of a boy of perhaps 10 who stood in the doorway watching her with his mouth open, as though a woman working iron were a species of miracle. She slept those first nights on a cot she fashioned from an old workbench and blankets from a carpet bag, and she ate sparingly from what her $11 could stretch to at Halloran's Mercantile, and in the evenings, by candlelight, she began the slow work of cataloging what Elias Pruitt had left behind, in part from practicality, in part from a growing curiosity about the solitary old man who had kept such an orderly, careful shop and yet had apparently wanted for nothing so much as somebody to notice him. It was on her 5th night in the forge, while running her hand along the back wall to judge how much soot had baked into the brick over the years, that Odessa first noticed a seam. The back wall of the forge, unlike the side walls, was built not of the same rough fieldstone as the rest of the structure but of brick, laid in a pattern that did not quite match itself, as though a section roughly 4 feet wide and shoulder height had been rebuilt at some point after the original construction. She might never have noticed it at all had she not spent her girlhood in her father's shop, learning to read surfaces the way other people read faces, and had the candlelight not fallen at just a low, raking angle that threw the slight unevenness of the mortar into shadow. She pressed her palm flat against the bricks and felt, very faintly, a gear that stone should not have, a hollowness behind the surface that made the hair rise on her arms. She told herself it was likely nothing, an old repair after some long-ago accident, a chimney fire perhaps, and she went to bed that night telling herself so, though sleep did not come easily. The following morning she began, carefully and without quite admitting to herself why her hands trembled, to work loose the mortar around one loose brick with a thin chisel from her father's roll. It came free after 20 minutes of patient work, and behind it was not solid stone but empty, cool darkness and the unmistakable edge of something wooden. By midday she had freed enough brick to reach her arm into the cavity, and what she drew out, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and stiff with age, was a small iron-bound chest no larger than a hat box, and beneath it, further back in the hollow, the corner of what felt like a second, larger object she could not yet reach. She set the chest on the workbench with hands that would not quite stop shaking and worked the simple hasp open, and inside, laid with obvious care atop a folded piece of oilskin, she found a leather ledger book, its pages foxed but legible, and beneath the ledger, a canvas pouch heavier than its size suggested, and a single folded letter addressed, in a careful, old-country hand, to whoever should one day find it. The letter, when Odessa unfolded it that evening by lamplight, was dated the 14th of March, 1878, only weeks before Elias Pruitt's death, and it changed, in the space of a single reading, everything she believed she knew about the town she had just moved into and the strange dead man whose home she now owned. Elias Pruitt wrote, in halting but earnest English, that he had come to America from Merthyr Tydfil in Wales as a young man, fleeing not poverty exactly, but a mining disaster in which he alone, of an entire crew of 11 men, had survived, an accident he blamed, rightly or wrongly, on a mine owner's refusal to shore up a known weak seam in order to save the cost of timber. He wrote that the guilt of surviving had followed him across an ocean and half a continent, and that for 30 years in Marrow's Bend he had quietly, methodically, and without ever once telling a living soul, set aside a portion of every dollar he earned shoeing horses and repairing wagon iron, not to enrich himself, for he lived like a man with nothing, but because he had come, slowly, to believe that a town was itself a kind of mine shaft, and that if you let its weak seams go unshored, sooner or later it would collapse on the people inside it just the same as any coal seam would. He had watched Marrow's Bend's fortunes decline for a decade, watched the rail spur promise come and go, watched families leave one by one, and he had resolved that when he died, whatever he had saved should not go to distant relatives who had never known him nor cared for the town, but should be used, carefully and wisely, to shore up Marrow's Bend itself, provided it fell into hands patient and honest enough to do it right rather than squander it. He had hidden it, he wrote, rather than declared it to any bank or official, because he trusted no living man in the town to use it justly, and he had sealed the wall himself, alone, at night, trusting instead to time and to whatever hands fate might one day send to find it. The ledger beneath the letter recorded, in his own meticulous hand, 30 years of savings, interest, and small investments in mining claims 2 counties over that he had quietly continued to hold, and a canvas pouch, when Odessa finally worked up the courage to open it, was heavy with gold and silver coin that she did not dare count that first night for fear her own eyes were deceiving her. She did not sleep at all. She sat at the workbench until dawn with the ledger open before her, doing the arithmetic again and again as though a 4th or 5th calculation might somehow produce a smaller, less staggering sum, and each time the figure held steady near $11,000 in coin, ledger credit, and the deeds to 2 small mining claims Pruitt had purchased and never worked, sitting untouched and nearly forgotten in Topeka land office. It was, by any measure available to a woman who had arrived in town 3 days earlier with $11 to her name, a fortune, and it was, by the plain language of the letter in her hand, not Hayes to spend on herself, but a trust laid upon whoever found it, to be used for Merrow's Bend. Word travels fast in a small town, and word of Odessa Vane's find, though she told almost no one, began to travel faster than she could have imagined, because the second object she had felt in the wall cavity, and finally freed 3 days later, was not treasure at all, but a strong box containing property deeds, record showing that Pruitt had, over the years, quietly bought up the tax liens on nearly a dozen abandoned lots throughout Merrow's Bend. The same empty, boarded storefronts everyone had written off as worthless, meaning to consolidate them, his letter explained, into land that could one day be given back to the town for a proper depot, should the railroad ever reconsider its spur, off for school, or whatever the town most needed. To free those deeds and register the change of ownership at the county clerk's office, Odessa had no choice but to go to Ezra Combs at the bank, and Ezra Combs, honest but talkative, could not help but mention the discovery to his wife, who could not help but mention it to her sister. And within 2 weeks all of Merrow's Bend knew that the widow who had bought the cursed old Ford for $4 had found Elias Pruitt's fortune sealed up behind a false wall. It was Corwin Vane who arrived at the forge first, on a bright Saturday morning 3 weeks after the discovery, his hat in his hands and an expression of wounded family feeling arranged carefully on his face, as though the sister-in-law he had turned out onto the road with carpet-bag were now, suddenly, dear to him again. He suggested, with a particular smoothness of a man rehearsing a speech in his own head before delivering it, that since Odessa had, after all, been married to a Vane, and since family ought to look after family in hard times, it was only right that she share what she had found with him, or failing that he might act as her adviser in matters of business, being, as he put it, more experienced in such things than a widow woman alone. Odessa listened to the entire speech without interrupting him, standing at her anvil with a hammer still in her hand, and when he finished she told him, quietly and without heat, that she remembered exactly whose family had looked after her when Thomas died, and that she had no further use for his advice on business or on any other matter, and that he was welcome to leave the way he had once told her to. Corwin's face went the color of an overripe plum, and he left threatening, vaguely, that a woman with that much sudden money would find the county had ways of taking a close interest in her affairs, and Odessa, who had faced down worse than Corwin Vane in her time, simply turned back to her forge and let him talk to her back. He was not, however, the only one to circle the widow with a forge full of gold. A land speculator from Wichita named Del Harmon arrived within the month, having read of the discovery in a regional paper, and he offered to buy the deeds to the abandoned lots outright at a price that would have made Odessa comfortable for the rest of her life, arguing smoothly that a woman alone could hardly be expected to manage property development, and that Merrow's Bend, frankly, was a dying town not worth saving. Ezra Combs, to his credit, cautioned her against signing anything quickly, but even he confessed, in a private and rather ashamed conversation, that the bank itself was in trouble, its reserves thin, its ledgers strained by 3 years of poor harvest, and that a sale to Harmon might be the only thing that kept the bank's doors open through another winter, which would in turn keep the whole town's meager savings from being lost entirely. The town council, such as it was, split into 2 loud and unhappy factions, one urging Odessa to take Harmon's money and be done with it, the other, led by a quietly determined school-teacher named Prudence Okafor, arguing that Pruitt's letter had named a purpose, and that purpose deserved to be honored rather than auctioned off to the highest outside bidder the moment it became inconvenient. Odessa spent 3 sleepless weeks turning it over, not because she doubted what Pruitt had asked of her, but because she doubted whether Melrose Bend, the same town that had laughed at a $4 bid and let a lonely old man die unremarked in the back of his own shop, deserved the gift being handed to it through her hands. It was, in the end, not a grand vision, but a small, ordinary sight that settled her mind. She watched, one late afternoon from her forge doorway, as Prudence Okafor's school children, a dozen of them, walked the length of Cinder Street on their way home because the schoolhouse roof had begun leaking so badly that lessons could only be held on dry days, and she thought of her own father, in a wheelwright shop half a continent and 40 years away, telling her that iron never lied to you if you were willing to listen to what it needed. A town, she decided, was not so very different. It did not need a stranger's charity handed down from a great height. It needed its weak seam shored carefully by someone who understood exactly where they had failed and why. She refused Del Harmon's offer outright, in front of the assembled council, and in the same breath she announced what she meant to do instead, having spent her sleepless weeks drawing up, with Ezra Combs's reluctant help, a plan as careful as anything her father had ever taught her about fitting a band to a wheel. She would use a portion of Pruitt's coin to shore up the bank's reserves directly, not as a gift but as a loan against the mining claim deeds, giving Ezra Combs a breathing room to keep the doors open through the coming winter without Corwin Vane or anyone else being able to claim she had simply enriched herself. She would deed the reclaimed lots, exactly as Pruitt's letter had asked, not to speculators but to the town itself, with a stipulation, written into the transfer papers by a lawyer from a county seat, that they be used for a proper schoolhouse and a public well, the two things Prudence Okafor's petition to the council had been asking for, unheeded, for 3 years. And she would keep the forge itself, not as a monument to a dead man's guilt, but as a working forge again, reopening Elias Pruitt's shop under her own hands, because a town rebuilding itself would need ironwork, and because she had discovered, in her weeks of clearing dust and freeing bricks, that she did not want to leave it. Corwin Vane made one final attempt to unsettle her plans, going before Judge Holstead in the county seat to contest, on behalf of the Vane family name, that any fortune found on land purchased with money a Vane widow had somehow concealed from him rightfully belonged to Vane kin. The claim collapsed within the hour, not because the judge had any particular fondness for Odessa, but because the ledger and letter were dated in witness years before Thomas Vane had even died, plainly establishing the fortune as Elias Pruitt's own to leave as he chose, and Corwin's petition was dismissed with a coolness that left him red-faced in the county courthouse hallway, the same hallway where, 3 months earlier, he had watched his sister-in-law forced to sign away the last of her old life. Word of his failed claim spread through Melrose Bend nearly as fast as word of the discovery itself had. And if there was any quiet justice in the whole affair, it was that Corwin Vane, who had once thought himself clever enough to starve a widow into dependence, found himself instead the subject of a town's gently amused disapproval, invited to fewer suppers, greeted with cooler nods on the street, a small and unspectacular comeuppance that suited him. Most people agreed. Exactly. By the following spring, Melrose Bend had a new schoolhouse roof, a working well at the center of town that no longer required a half-mile walk in drought season, and a bank that had weathered its worst year in a decade without a single depositor losing a cent, thanks to a loan whose true source most townsfolk never knew in full detail, because Odessa had asked Ezra Combs to keep her name off the paperwork wherever the law allowed, saying she had not done it to be thanked. The forge on Cinder Street, meanwhile, had become the busiest shop in town, its chimney smoking steadily again for the first time in 9 years, its emblem ringing out across a street no longer half abandoned, because a rebuilding town need hinges and wagon iron and plow blades, and Odessa Vane, it turned out, was very good at her work, having learned at her father's side before she had learned to read. The boy who had first watched her from the doorway that first week, a quiet child named Silas whose family had nearly left town the previous winter for lack of any prospects, became her apprentice, and in him Odessa saw something of the patience her own father had once tried to instill in a grieving girl standing at a bellows. We began this story by telling you that Odessa Vane was 38 years old and had nothing in the world but a carpet bag and $11, cast out by a brother-in-law who believed a widow's usefulness ended the moment her husband was in the ground, and we told you she spent that last handful of money on a forge the whole town had already decided was worthless. We did not tell you then what waited behind that false wall, because we wanted you to sit, as she once sat, in the not knowing, in the particular courage it takes to spend your very last dollars on something everyone else has already written off. What Odessa found was not simply gold, though there was gold, and it was not simply a dead man's confession, though there was that too. What she found, in the end, was a truth her own father had tried to teach her decades earlier in a wheelwright shop in Virginia, that nothing broken, and no one overlooked, is ever quite so worthless as a world in its hurry has decided. Elias Pruitt spent 30 lonely years believing himself unworthy of forgiveness for disaster that was never his fault, and he poured that guilt quietly into a town that scarcely knew his name, trusting that someday someone patient enough to listen to what a wool wanted to tell her would find it and finish what he could not bring himself to do while he lived, which was to be truly, openly generous. Odessa Vane, cast off and laughed at, was that someone, not because fortune smiled on her by accident, but because a lifetime of being told her worth was small had never once convinced her it was true, and she carried that quiet, stubborn dignity into a dead man's shop and let it do its slow work, exactly as her father once promised her it would. Thank you for spending this time with Odessa's story and with Merrow's Bend, a town that very nearly forgot itself and was, in the end, remembered by the very woman it had once dismissed. If any part of her journey moved you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder tonight, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? There is no shame in starting over with next to nothing in your hands, and there is no telling what quiet truths might be waiting, patient as old iron, behind a wall nobody else thought worth opening. Until next time, stay close.